I warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor. You have the floor, please.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank Sierra Leone for convening this debate. Since 1945, the United Nations Security Council has been a bedrock of global peace and security. But the cracks in its foundation are becoming too large to ignore. And they are contributing to deadlock, stalemate, and stagnation around today's most pressing crises. And they are feeding a broader crisis of credibility and legitimacy that is affecting multilateralism itself. The Security Council was designed by the victors of the Second World War and reflects the power structures of that time. And the world has changed since 1945. But the composition of the Council, despite a few changes, has not kept pace. In 1945, most of today's African countries were still under colonial rule and had no voice in international affairs. This created a glaring omission that has remained unresolved until now. There is no permanent member representing Africa in the Security Council, and the number of elected members from the continent is not in proportion to its importance. We cannot accept that the world's preeminent peace and security body lacks a permanent voice for a continent of well over 1 billion people, a young and rapidly growing population, making up 28% of the membership of the United Nations. Nor can we accept that Africa's views are undervalued on questions of peace and security, both on the continent and around the world. Mr. President, Excellencies, Africa is underrepresented in global governance structures, from the Security Council to international financial institutions, but overrepresented in the very challenges these structures are designed to address. Conflicts, emergencies, and geopolitical divisions have an outsized impact on the African continent. And this Council's agenda demonstrates this. Nearly half of all country-specific or regional conflicts on your agenda concern Africa. They are often exacerbated by greed for Africa's resources, which are vital to the global economy, and further spread and aggravated by the interference of external actors. The message is clear: there can be no global security without African security. Meanwhile, African countries are ground down by crushing debt burdens and the lack of financing thanks to the global financial architecture in which they are underrepresented and denied the level of support they require. And they contend with ferocious flooding and droughts caused by a climate crisis they did nothing to create. But through it all, Africa has proven to be a willing and able partner for peace, particularly with the United Nations, both on the continent and beyond. Through the joint United Nations-African Union framework for enhanced partnership in peace and security, we are addressing complex challenges on the continent, from the Central African Republic to Somalia, the Sahel, and the crisis in Sudan. We are working with the African Union and regional and sub-regional organizations such as ECOWAS to end the scourge of terrorism, which has killed tens of thousands on the African continent, including 11 of our personnel in the Abuja bombing of 2011. Together, we are helping to ensure security, stability, and respect for human rights and the rule of law while supporting democratic processes and institutions. And this Council's Resolution 2719 has now established a framework for predictable financing of African Union-led peace support operations authorized by the Security Council through assessed contributions, an important vote of confidence in African capacities and in our partnership. We are now developing a joint roadmap to carry these forward. Meanwhile, African countries host almost half of all UN peacekeeping operations, while contributing troops of their own to global hotspots over the years, including now in Lebanon. Over 40% of UN peacekeepers are African. And let's not forget the meaningful efforts made by African-led forces to restore peace, from Somalia to Lake Chad, from Mozambique to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In times of crisis and geopolitical division, African countries are often amongst the first to champion peace, multilateral solutions, and adherence to international law and UN Charter. But African efforts and contributions are not being matched by Africa's representation. Ensuring this Council's full credibility and legitimacy means heeding the long-standing call for the UN General Assembly, from the UN General Assembly, various geographic groups, from the Arab group to the Benelux, Nordic and CARICOM countries, and some permanent members of this Council itself, to correct this injustice. Mr. President, Excellencies, for different parts of the world to contribute to its proceedings, reform of this Council's membership must be accompanied by a democratization of its working methods. A new agenda for peace puts forward a number of ideas, from more burden sharing among Council members to more systematic consultations with host states and regional organizations, as well as with countries contributing troops and police. And it also calls for improvements and innovation in other parts of the global architecture whose work has a bearing on peace and security. It recommends that member states elevate the work of the Peacebuilding Commission to realize the untapped potential and help mobilize support for national and regional prevention strategies. This includes closer ties with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and regional development banks to secure sustainable financing for countries as they strengthen peace and security, with important implications for countries on the African continent. The Peacebuilding Fund has been a critical catalyst to mobilize the contribution of international financial institutions. The agenda also calls for a revitalized role of the General Assembly in the area of peace and security. A new agenda for peace has been informing negotiations on the Pact for the Future to be adopted at next month's Summit of the Future. The summit provides a critical opportunity to make progress on these issues and help ensure that all countries can meaningfully participate in global governance structures as equals. I urge all member states to attend and contribute their views and ideas so that African voices are heard, African initiatives are supported, and African needs are met. Monsieur le Président, Excellences, les voix de l'Afrique, les idées de l'Afrique et la participation de l'Afrique doivent être pleinement prises en compte dans les délibérations et les travaux du Conseil. Il ne s'agit pas seulement d'une question d'éthique et de justice, mais aussi d'un impératif stratégique pour accroître l'adhésion globale des décisions du Conseil, ce qui sera bénéfique pour l'Afrique et pour le monde. J'appelle tous les États membres à saisir cette occasion pour élaborer un pacte pour l'avenir ambitieux qui jette les bases d'une architecture mondiale de paix et de sécurité représentant vraiment tous les pays sur un pied d'égalité.